Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Games I've Wanted to Play, the series in which I dig through the treasure trove of gaming's past and bring to you a game that I've always wanted to check out. Now, today's episode is a special one, as this is a game that I actually owned all the way back in 1998. I got quite far in it back in the day, but I never did complete it, and when I did go back to complete it, my save file got lost, so lost a lot of progress there, unfortunately. Now, it is one that I've always wanted to go back and finish, and despite numerous attempts, I've never actually been able to set aside the time to actually go through the entire thing. There's been various false starts, and yeah, I really want to go through it for this video, and the game in question is Tomb Raider 2. Now, as a series, I feel like Tomb Raider needs very little introduction. It was originally developed by Core and published by Eidos. The first Tomb Raider game was actually released back in 1996 on the Sega Saturn, the Sony PlayStation and the PC, and it was released to widespread critical and commercial success, and it spawned a multimedia franchise that would go on to encompass a number of sequels, movies, comic books, and of course the main character Lara Croft would become a massive crossover star in her own right, appearing in music videos, adverts, and being a cover model for those horrible lads mags that existed in the late 90s, early 2000s. And it could even be said that, despite the fact that, as mentioned, the game appeared on the Saturn and the PC, the first Tomb Raider is one of those games that really helped solidify the success of the PlayStation, and there was always this very close association between the PlayStation brand and Tomb Raider or Lara Croft. And the point is, back in the 90s, everyone knew who Lara Croft was, whether you were into video games or not, you knew that name. Now, it could also be said that whilst being a big series, the franchise isn't quite what it was. So here's the basic premise if you aren't aware. The franchise follows the exploits of Lara Croft. She's a wealthy British explorer who hunts down and tries to retrieve various artifacts. Generally, she wants to get to them before a group of bad guys do, as the bad guys always plan to use the artifacts for nefarious means. It's very much inspired by Indiana Jones. Lara could be said to be a female Indiana Jones as such. It's generally quite grounded for most of it, but there's always a sort of supernatural and spiritual element to whatever is being tracked down. It's a very simple premise, but it's been responsible for some amazing moments in gaming. Now, the first game I played in the series was Tomb Raider 2. I first played it, or at least I was introduced to it, in the winter of 1997. It was around a friend's house, and I didn't get to play it, he showed me it, and admittedly, I didn't think too much of it at the time. It left an impression, certainly, but it wasn't something I really desired. But it wasn't until a few months later, around another friend's place, he actually got the game, we played it together over an evening when I was staying over, we worked out how to do the opening level, and that was when I really started to enjoy it. So I remember seeing it in a store, I think it was PC World at the time, when I was out with my parents. I asked for it, they bought it for me, and that was it. Went home, fell in love with it. Now, first up, and it's something I mentioned a few times, but what I really fell in love with was the globetrotting aspect of it. I love the fact that you've got one level being set in one location, the next level being set in another. I think that's something I always kind of enjoyed from a young age, being into platformers with very defined worlds, and also one of my first games being the point and click of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where you would go from, location to location. The levels themselves, though, they were huge, they were expansive, there was a satisfaction in figuring out how to get around them and complete them. In Tomb Raider 2, Lara is on hunt for the dagger of Xian, a mythical Chinese dagger, which was said to have been wielded by one of the ancient Chinese emperors to command his army of men and turn the tide in any war. Lara is, of course, not going to find it easy to track down the dagger, because it's also being sought after by an Italian cult led by Marco Bartolli, not to be confused by Bertoli, the butter people. Lara will go from location to location, trying to find out where the artifact is, but also how to gain access to where it is being kept. The main focus on the game, as in most of the Tomb Raider games, is on the traversal, figuring out how to get from point A to point B via climbing, jumping, grabbing, and avoiding whatever deadly obstacles have been put in your way. You also have enemies to fight, and a few kind of basic puzzles to solve. So there you have it, bit of a rundown of the premise of Tomb Raider and Tomb Raider 2. Let's go on to what my expectations are for the game then. Well, for once, I'm not expecting the game to be difficult. I'm already extremely familiar with this game, as covered previously, so despite having not played it for quite a while, I still know and remember how it plays, so I feel like I know what to expect here. I am expecting a tough but fair challenge, one that relies on a little bit of trial and error until I know the correct routes to take, how to perform the jumps and the correct actions to get me from that point A to point B. That sort of thing will certainly come into play during time sequences, of which I do remember there being quite a few. Now, from what I recall, there were a few levels were a bit tricky to navigate, so I'm thinking I will get lost in these levels a few times. I also seem to remember the underwater and monastery levels being particularly problematic for you getting lost and having to spend quite a lot of time backtracking and working out where the hell to go next. As far as other elements of the game go, the combat, I do remember that it wasn't great. It was very much you see an enemy, Lara will point her guns towards the enemy and shoot. There wasn't a lot of depth to it, and that's basically it. This is quite a short section, but I'm very excited to dig in and start playing it. So let's see how my first 30 minutes go. As mentioned, I'm already extremely familiar with this game, but I decided I wanted to talk about everything that this game has to offer instead of just hopping into the main story straight away, because I really wanted to show this off to you all. So my first action was to swing by Croft Manor. But seriously, one of the cool features within a Tomb Raider games is the ability to explore Lara's home, Croft Manor. It's usually a place filled with Easter eggs that reference the other titles, but it also serves as a little bit of a miniature tutorial to allow you to get used to the game's controls. For this game, Lara has had an assault course built for her because she just can't get enough of the Krypton factor. It's through this you'll learn most, if not all, of the game's primary mechanics. You'll learn your basic movement, various types of jump, how to gauge the timing and distances for jumps, how to climb ledges, your shimmying, your swimming, your diving, and so on. I do think if you're coming to this game having only played the modern Tomb Raider games or something like Uncharted or Assassin's Creed, having this sort of open space and safe space to practice is super beneficial, especially because of how finicky Tomb Raider can be in these earlier games. See, the one major difference between the modern titles is usually the player will auto-grab onto handholds. You still have to get the timing right at times, but the games will use little tricks to kind of compensate for that. You know, they'll sort of pull you into place, magnetize you. In some games, it's actually really noticeable, but as time's gone on, it's less so. And that's absolutely fine. But Tomb Raider 2 uses more tankier controls. I believe it's based on what they call a grid-based system. So you have to start in the right spot, you have to line things up correctly, you have to run the right distance for a running jump. And it's all super important to make sure you get all of that right. Players also had to be mindful that there is this additional grab button to press when you're jumping at a ledge. If you forget about it, then death occurs. And there is this debate about this kind of control system. Some people nowadays really dislike it, and I think some people even disliked it back then. I can understand why. It can feel awkward to get used to at first, but personally, I've always really enjoyed it. It's a very satisfying control system when you're able to conquer it, when you're able to do these trickier maneuvers without any issues, and when you start to chain it all together and just get through the levels without a problem, it feels fantastic. There's definitely a learning curve, but I think if you persevere with this, tutorial and some of the earlier levels, you'll really enjoy it when you're used to it. So, we locked the butler in the freezer, we ran the assault course once or twice, and then I hopped into the main game. First level takes place at the Great Wall of China, and almost immediately you get the sense of the combat as a tiger rushes towards you. Fortunately, it's pretty easy to avoid. You can just hop up out of reach and kill it from a block. Now, I do remember as a kid, me and my friend struggling with the opening at this level for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, because you look at it like, for me it's like 25 years on. It seems really obvious where to go, and, in our defense, we were kids, and I have played it numerous times since. But I feel like the first level, your assault course gives you a taste for all of your movement, the first level gives you a taste of everything you're going to face in the main game. You've got a fair bit of traversal to deal with. You've got some combat to deal with. Basic, block puzzle where you have to move a block out the way. And there's also a lot of sequence in the level with a lot of death traps. The weird thing about it is I actually kind of feel like the first level is quite tough compared to the ones that follow it. Especially when you get to this faster paced trap section, it's very easy to die here or end up losing a lot of health. So between messing about in the manor and then getting through the first level, that got me to about the 30-minute mark, and as expected, I'm immediately back in love with this game. So let's see how I get on with the rest of it. With the first level complete, Lara encounters a massive door through which we can get to the famed dagger of Xian. It all seems a bit too easy, doesn't it? But you can't open that door when we're attacked by a burly man working for the aforementioned Marco Bartolli. Again, not to be confused with Bertolli of Butter fame. We find out that the cult has or is close to finding what we need to open that door, so off we go to Venice to track down Bartolli. Venice is quite an interesting level and one that did stand out to me as a kid, because Tomb Raider is known for raiding ancient tombs, and while Venice is a old ancient city full of wondrous history, you're not raiding a tomb here, you're not delving into an ancient civilization, you're trying to track down some mafia goons and get what they have, or figure out where what they need is before they do. So it's on this level you get your first taste of vehicle usage. Tomb Raider 2 introduced a few vehicles to use. You'll use a boat on the opening level a few times to navigate the waterways of the city. Boat handles fine, it does the job. There's a time sequence here where you use the boat, where you have to get through an open door before it closes, and due to the tight gaps and somewhat slidey controls, it might take a few goes. Throughout the next 3 or so levels set in Venice, there are some really fun challenges here to work through, a lot of tricky gaps to traverse, a few combat sections to get through, and those aforementioned vehicle parts that don't really outstay their welcome. I should probably take this opportunity to discuss the difficulty of the game, actually. One thing Tomb Raider 2 has, and when I was speaking to other people about it, is it's got a bit of a difficulty curve. Some people actually found it really hard at the time. But one thing it does to kind of compensate, I guess, is it has the ability to save anywhere, which, you know, if you're about to do a quite tricky sequence or you see something tough ahead of you, you can save, go back to it if you fail and lose a lot of health or die. It's easy to go back to. It's quite nice. A lot of console games of this era didn't necessarily have the ability to save anywhere. Certainly very few are coming to mind. A lot of them were either checkpoint based, save point based, but stuff like Tomb Raider 2 allowed you to do that, or like Metal Gear Solid, as an example, allowed you to. It's especially useful because, like mentioned, the platforming in the game isn't always the easiest. It's always going to take you a few goes maybe for a couple of the gaps, so having it, absolute godsend. Venice gives us a bit more combat. You'll be fighting dogs, you'll be fighting rats, you'll be fighting men with bats, and men with guns. The combat, as mentioned, my expectations, it's not great. It's not even really good. I don't think it was lauded as such back in the day. Lara draws weapons, aims at a nearby enemy, you shoot at them while trying to dodge or keep distance. If anything, it sometimes feels like a bit of a nuisance that breaks up the more fun traversal aspects of the game. From Venice, we move on to an offshore oil rig. It's another level that stood out to me as a kid, and I think it's mostly because there's one level where there's a goon with a flamethrower, which I always thought was a little bit unfair back then. After that, on your way to an underwater wreck, and it's actually one of Tomb Raider 2's scariest moments. You went to a level called 40 Fathoms where you're immediately underwater. You've got to get to an opening in a wrecked ship, and there's a shark pursuing you, which is still quite a tense moment, despite the fact that I'm playing a game from 1998. I guess being chased by a giant shark never really stops being scary. And if I'm being completely honest, while I do like these levels, I found the Maria de Ria, the underwater wreck, to be a little bit of a drag. You're in this underwater wreck for 4 entire levels, and I do feel like they could have slimmed it down significantly here. It does feel a little bit repetitive and a little bit pointless. But we get done plundering the depths, and we move on to Tibet, and there's another big vehicle section here. This time it's a snowmobile, and it's with us for most of this first level in Tibet. We use it for quite a few tricky jumps, escaping some traps, and being pursued by other enemies. The surprising thing is it handles really well. It's again a little bit slidey, but it's not the worst for a game of this era. The Tibetan levels also have you stop by a place called the Barkang Monastery, which has another cool little feature. It's here where you'll find the monks of the monastery in combat with members of Bartolli's cult. The monks are allied with you as long as you don't attack them, so you've got to be careful when you've got guns drawn to not accidentally attack them, because they will turn on you. But what they do is they attack members of the cult for you. In a lot of cases, they can actually kill the members of the cult or seriously slim them down, so it saves you health, it saves you ammo, it saves you a little bit of time there. And they'll also just let you loot and pillage their death trap-ridden monastery, and seriously, between the traps on the oil rig, the awkward sequences in Venice and this place, it must be a nightmare going for a pee in the Tomb Raider universe. You know, alright Jeff, just press the button over there, hop past these burners that are on a timer, slide down the ramp, do a backflip at the end, and you'll reach the bogs. Or out a toilet roll, now you see. You know, you get the idea. Now, these levels are really fun, although the monastery itself can be quite challenging and very easy to lose your way due to the amount of backtracking and paths to take. This eventually leads to an ice cavern level where you'll end up fighting some yetis, because why not? And there's also a kind of boss at the end of the Tibet levels, and you can beat it by standing out of reach and shooting it. It's not much of a challenge. You finish up Tibet, brings us back to China, back to the Temple of Xian to recover our lost dagger. The temple is a huge level. Similar to the monastery, you've got this central hub, plenty of paths to take, and eventually you get what you need. It's one of the tougher levels in the game because there's a lot of traps there, there's a lot of enemies to fight, including giant spiders, because of course there are. Now, alright, there's only 5 of the buggers, and they're in one little section of the map, but as a massive arachnophobe, didn't appreciate it. And then the final 2 levels, once you get through the Temple of Xian, you traverse this really bizarre maze of floating islands and fight these huge statues that have come to life. And then you eventually confront Bartolli in what seemed like a super easy boss fight, as I was able to get him stuck in place. There's a little epilogue afterwards featuring Lara at home having to defend herself against some of Bartolli's goons, and that's it. All done in about 12.5 hours. There were a few things I didn't mention throughout that little rundown. There's secrets scattered throughout every level, 3 of which. They can be tricky to find, but it's kind of worth it, because they net you extra ammo and supplies if you manage to get all 3 in a level. Didn't really touch on the soundtrack or the audio here either. Music in the game is fine. It'll trigger at certain points and usually like a little bit of a burst. It creates a neat atmosphere, but it doesn't hang around too long. It's not really any sort of ambient music here. It's just sort of like you'll be doing something, music sting for about 10 seconds, then back to sort of the silent traversal. The audio itself, kind of fine. Lara has a very... whenever you try to interact with something and you don't have the appropriate key, Lara will just kind of say no at you in a very disappointed tone of voice. But there we have it. Your game is complete, and what are my final thoughts on it? One of the main factors in making this video is because I knew it would encourage me to finally complete this game. But I also, as mentioned before, really wanted to share it with everyone and also talk about why it's like one of my favourite games and go through it and give it a little bit of love and appreciation. Because I feel like these classic Tomb Raider games kind of get a little bit derided now. They kind of, you know, people look back on them and kind of give them a little bit of grief. But it's one of those that in the past 20 years since I played it, I'm able to go back to it and enjoy it and have a really good time, and I'm very happy that I actually got to complete it and share that with everyone. Now, if I was going to recommend it to anyone who hasn't played one of these games, being honest about it, I would say there are aspects that haven't aged gracefully. The graphics are very early PS1 era, so they don't look amazing. The combat, as mentioned, is poor, although I think even back then it was never classed as being great. And those controls can be awkward and tough to get used to. But there is a charm to it. It feels rewarding to play, the core level design and gameplay feels very nice to get used to, and I think if you take your time with it, if you persevere with it, if you learn the quirks of it, everything will click into place. I do believe anyone could still have a great time with those original Tomb Raider titles, especially Tomb Raider 2. I also really do think it's worth checking out, just so you can all see where this franchise began. these games that launched a character into being a cross-media megastar that helped propel gaming to greater heights and played a big part in the legacy of Sony's little grey box. I know I talk from a place of nostalgia with these games, there's a hint of rose-tintedness, but please definitely give the game a go, give the early series a go, because I still think they're wonderful games and I think you can have a lot of fun with them. And with all of that said, I just wanted to say thank you all for taking the time to watch this video. I do really appreciate and hope you all enjoyed it. And please do go and check out the other videos from the Games I've Wanted to Play playlist on the channel. Do leave a comment and share any of your own memories of this series with me. Put a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and I shall hopefully see you again in a future video. Goodbye.